What if the birthplace of humanity carried genetic fingerprints from a land across the sea? The land we call the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, is carved into our DNA as the beginning. It's where Homo sapiens stood upright more than 200,000 years ago, walked the highlands and whispered the first human words. Fossils like Homo homins are dated to approximately 233,000 years ago, and the Herto skull, approximately 160,000 years ago, prove it. This is not theory. This is hard scientific fact. But what if I told you that in this very same region, this so-called pure cradle of mankind, we've now found up to 50% Eurasian ancestry in its people? In populations like the Oromo, Somali and Amhara, the DNA doesn't just point south, it points back across the Red Sea to Anatolia, the Levant and the ancient Fertile Crescent. This isn't just a minor genetic signature, this is a demographic shockwave, a massive West Eurasian back migration confirmed by ancient DNA analysis reshaped the entire genetic landscape of the Horn around 3,000 years ago, long after humans first left Africa. 2 migrations, one that made the world and one that returned to change the motherland. The first, the out of Africa migration, took place roughly 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, where a small group of Homo sapiens, all descended from the L3 mitochondrial haplogroup, born right here in East Africa, crossed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, launching humanity's global journey. But it's the second migration that no textbook taught you. Around 1000 BCE, a wave of Neolithic West Eurasian farmers, genetically similar to early European farmers and modern Sardinians, crossed back into the Horn. This wasn't a few traders or scattered families. Genetic modelling suggests they replaced or mixed with up to 25 to 50% of the local population. And they brought more than DNA. They brought wheat, barley, new tools, Semitic languages, and possibly even myth. This backflow coincides with the rise of the Kingdom of Dimti, early contact with Sabaean Arabs, and the whispered stories of a queen who crossed the sea. All of it written not in books, but in bones. And the gateway for all of this, the narrow stretch of water still dividing Djibouti from Yemen, Bab el-Mandeb, once a launching point for the human exodus, now proven to be a two-way genetic corridor. So let's drop the idea of the Horn being isolated, untouched. Its DNA tells a different story, one of movement, collision, and cultural fusion. Not a backwater, not a boundary, a living intersection of continents, bloodlines and time. But if modern Africans of the Horn carry Near Eastern genes, who exactly brought them here, and why? In a forgotten cave, a 4,500-year-old skeleton held a secret no one expected, the untouched genome of pre-invasion Africa. To find that answer, scientists had to go backwards, not through myth, not through language, but through something older. Bone. In 2011, deep in the Gamo highlands of southwestern Ethiopia, in a narrow cave known as Mota, researchers uncovered a human skeleton, curled, silent, undisturbed for over 4,500 years. Radiocarbon dating placed him at approximately 2,500 BCE, before Solomon, before Sabaeans, before any trace of Eurasian presence in Africa. When his genome was sequenced in 2015, the world changed. This wasn't just an old skeleton. Mota was the first ancient African ever to be genetically decoded, and what he revealed was shocking. His DNA carried no Eurasian admixture, none. A perfect snapshot of African genetics before the Great Return. he stood untouched by the genetic backflow that would wash over the Horn 1,500 years later. Even more astonishing, his genome matched most closely with the modern-day Ari Highlanders, a small ethnic group still living in Ethiopia's south. That means, across nearly 5 millennia, some bloodlines in the Horn remained remarkably unbroken. This is more than continuity, this is survival. Mota also showed us the world he came from. His genes displayed adaptations to high-altitude living, likely helping him thrive in oxygen-thin air. But he lacked the gene for lactose tolerance, meaning milk had not yet become a daily part of African life. A reminder that agriculture and herding were still unfolding, still taking root, and perhaps most importantly, Mota became the scientific yardstick. The control sample, the pre-migration reference genome used to measure exactly how much Eurasian ancestry entered East Africa later on. Without him, the scale of that change would have remained invisible. But what happened next wasn't gradual, it was an avalanche. But then, just 1,500 years after Mota, the floodgates of genetic change burst open. Who caused it? Around 1000 BCE, a genetic earthquake shook the Horn, a migration so large it changed the face of Africa forever. The answer didn't lie in the soil of Ethiopia, it came from across the sea. Because something monumental happened around 1000 BCE, a turning point so sharp it carved a second beginning into the Horn's history. Scientists call it a genetic replacement event, a mass-scale migration that didn't just blend into local DNA, it rewrote it. The people who arrived carried Neolithic West Eurasian ancestry, closely matching that of early European farmers and strikingly similar to modern Sardinians, a group still isolated on the edge of Europe today. This was not a subtle drift. Based on genome-wide comparisons with Mota's pristine African profile, these new arrivals replaced or mixed with up to 25 to 50% of the local gene pool. That's not migration, that's transformation. And their arrival left fingerprints everywhere, in their blood, near Eastern Neolithic DNA, in their tools, ploughs, grinding stones, grain silos, in their food, wheat, barley, lentils, crops never native to the Horn, and in their words, possibly the first threads of Semitic, languages woven into the highlands. This wasn't climate collapse, it wasn't war. This was something else, a wave of culture, belief, and technology, carried not by armies, but by farmers, priests, and traders. As this new hybrid identity formed, kingdoms began to rise. The kingdom of Demt, between the 10th and 8th centuries BCE, emerged in what's now Eritrea and northern Ethiopia, showing early writing systems, stone temples, and clear links to the Sabaean culture of South Arabia. But here's where the mystery deepens, because the DNA signature in the Horn doesn't perfectly match Arabia. Some studies trace it instead to the Levant, ancient Canaanite lands, from modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. But was this migration Arabian, or did it come from the Levant, or both? Science is torn between two coasts. Was it southern Arabia or the Levant that changed African DNA forever? The Horn of Africa faces a narrow sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, just 30 kilometers wide, separating Africa from Arabia. And somewhere across that sliver of water, the origins of half a genome crossed. But which shore did it step from? Here lies one of the fiercest debates in ancient DNA. Some geneticists point towards southern Arabia, others argue for the Levant, far to the north. And both sides bring powerful evidence to the table. Mitochondrial DNA, passed through the maternal line, tells one story. Haplogroups like R, 0A and M1, found today in modern Yemeni and Horn populations, suggest an ancient maternal thread linking Ethiopia and Hadramaut. These markers hint at a deep, intimate connection, not from war, but from wombs. But then, the autosomal DNA, the broader genome-wide profile, tells another tale. Studies show a strong affinity to Neolithic Levantine farmers, people who lived in what's now Lebanon, Israel and Syria around 9,000 years ago, during the earliest agricultural revolutions. Linguistics doesn't solve it, it complicates it. The Ethio-Semitic languages spoken by millions across Ethiopia and Eritrea carry echoes of both Sabaean script from Arabia Felix and older Canaanite roots from the Levant. It's as if the tongues of both worlds converged on this one mountainous edge of Africa. Then there's the Y chromosome trail, the paternal inheritance. Haplogroups like J1 and T, dominant in the Arabian Peninsula and the Eastern Mediterranean, are now commonly found among Amhara, Tigray and Somali males. Another whisper of origin, another direction pointed. But this isn't just science, it's about myth, politics and pride. Some nations seek Arabian origin to affirm ancient trade empires. Others lean Levantine, tying themselves to biblical bloodlines and pre-Islamic mysticism. The DNA is pulled between identity narratives as much as it is by phylogenetics. And yet, in all this back and forth, one anomaly remains untouched. But deeper in the genetic code lies something even stranger, DNA not from Arabia, and not from Earth as we know it. Hidden inside modern genomes are shadows of ancient species that don't exist anymore. Buried in the genomes of living people are echoes from other kinds of humans, species that no longer walk this earth. Their bones are rare, their faces are gone, but their DNA, fragments of it, still lives in us. In you. It's called ghost DNA, not a metaphor, a scientific term for real genetic traces from unknown archaic hominins, ancient human relatives who interbred with us, and then vanished. Their bodies left no fossil record. But their genes refused to die. Here's where it gets strange. When West Eurasians migrated back into the Horn of Africa around 1000 BCE, they didn't come alone. They carried Neanderthal DNA, around 1% of their genome, inherited from interbreeding that happened outside Africa, about 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, somewhere between the Levant and Central Asia. That Neanderthal code, foreign and ancient, now sits in the bones of East African populations. A piece of Ice Age Europe, living in the Rift Valley. But West Africans, like the Yoruba of Nigeria, tell a different story. They never left Africa, and in their blood, scientists found something far older and far more mysterious. Up to 19% DNA from an archaic ghost population, completely unknown to science. No fossils, no name. Possibly older than even Neanderthals or Denisovans. These genes appeared to have entered the West African genome approximately 35,000 to 50,000 years ago, from a hominin that split off over 1 million years ago. Here's the haunting twist. Populations in the Horn don't carry that same ghost DNA. Instead, their genome, heavily shaped by Eurasian backflow, seems to have diluted or replaced those ancient African lineages. The genetic memory of the deepest African ancestors may have been overwritten, like a hard drive with new data. So now we're left with a question science alone can't answer. Were these ghost species human, subhuman, or something else entirely? If so, could oral myths of shapeshifters, were hyenas or spirit ancestors, be echoes of real hybrid memories? Every human alive outside Africa descends from one woman, and she may have lived in the Horn. Because long before these stories took shape in firelight, another tale was already being written. Not in ink, but in mitochondrial strands. A genetic whisper passed from mother to child across thousands of generations. And at the root of it all is her. El3, a woman who lived roughly 70,000 years ago, most likely in what is now Ethiopia or Sudan. She was not the first human. She was not the only woman alive, but from her mitochondrial DNA, a specific marker passed only through mothers, came something no other lineage could match. Every single person living outside of Africa today descends from her. Every European, every East Asian, every Native American, every Pacific Islander, all carry the legacy of haplogroup L3. Her daughters M and N were the pioneers. They journeyed out of Africa. One group moved east, another north, spreading this genetic signature across the world. From the rice fields of China to the Andes of Peru, they carried L3's mitochondrial flame. The timing matches perfectly with the great out-of-Africa migration. And it wasn't random. The route, supported by genetics and archaeology, likely followed the southern coastal path, crossing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait when sea levels were lower, and the journey could be made in rafts or by foot across narrow channels. This is not theory anymore. It's being traced through both genomic evidence and archaeological finds. In the very soil of the Horn, her echoes linger. Fossils like Omurgi, dated to about 233,000 years ago, and the Herto skull, at 160,000 years, prove that anatomically modern humans emerged here first. The Horn wasn't just a homeland, it was the launch pad of the human diaspora. But just as her children began to leave, something unexpected happened. But just as people were leaving the Horn to populate the world, others were already arriving. A single strand of 4,000-year-old hair found in Sudan turned ancient migration theories on their head. And then one fragile thread survived. A 4,000-year-old hair from a burial in Kadruka, northern Sudan, discovered in 2022. One thin filament, weathered by millennia, yet carrying secrets no crystal skull could ever hold. This wasn't found in the desert of Arabia. It wasn't born on camels. It lay buried in Nubian dust, waiting. When scientists extracted DNA from that hair, they braced for failure. DNA in hair fades, degrades, disintegrates, but the result was nothing short of stunning. The genome linked to early Eastern African pastoralists, surprisingly close to those known in Tanzania around 3,100 years before present. A culture of herders spreading across the continent. Even more revealing, chemical analysis of his teeth preserved milk proteins, proof that he was a pastoralist, that he drank milk. Isotopes revealed a C3 plant-heavy diet, unlike the C4 grains that dominated later agriculture. This ancient act of herding, raising animals, milking them, building a pastoralist existence, may have originated not in Arabia or the Levant, but in internal Africa. It suggests a wave of north to south African gene flow, predating or weaving through the later Eurasian back migrations we've tracked in the Horn. Think about that. Sudan, not southern Arabia, may have been a genetic and cultural staging ground for the pastoral revolution, a forgotten epicenter of ancient human migration, a strand of hair, not a shovel full of pottery, telling us that the story of African herders might need a total rewrite, that the Horn's genetic mosaic may partly spring from homegrown movements, not just foreign arrivals. So now, as we gaze at the genetic tapestry of the Horn, woven with Eurasian farmers, ancient mothers of humanity, mysterious ghost ancestors, and now African pastoralists, we must ask ourselves, could these early African herders have merged with incoming Eurasians, creating the hybrid cultures we see today? Modern Somali and Ethiopian genomes don't look like anyone else's, because they aren't. That question now finds its answer in the very strands of Horn DNA. Enter the realm of Ethio-Somali and Ethiopic genetic signatures. They don't match West African, North African, or even Arabian clusters. They are mosaics exclusive to the Horn. These are not diluted echoes. They are a bold, layered narrative of identity and survival. Through genome-wide clustering, we observe that Somalis, Amaras and Oromos, though neighbours, carry distinct genetic compositions. Somali profiles lean more toward Cushitic roots, while Amaras show stronger West Eurasian admixture. Oromos sit in between. This isn't confusing, it's evidence. Evidence that these ancestries solidified after the massive migration around 3,000 years ago, tempered by linguistic evolution, cultural fusion, and ecological isolation in the highlands. These genetic mosaics emerged in a rugged topography, where language lines, Amharic, Oromo, Somali, drawn on the land, reinforced genetic boundaries too. Visualize cliffs and plateaus carving not just terrain, but bloodlines. Each valley held its own story, each mountain passed its own village, and within them, DNA wove a unique tapestry over millennia. Calling Horn DNA strange minimizes its depth. It's not strange, it is ancient. Haunted by migrations, forged in isolation, enriched by a journey unseen in any other population. It holds the story of herders in Sudan, Eurasians crossing Bab el-Mandeb, ancestors bearing L3, and ghost lineages slipping out of memory. Now, imagine that within this tapestry lies more than DNA. Myth, memory, identity. Stories older than written words, echoing in every Highland ritual, in every oral legend. But what if the myths we ignored all along held the key to understanding these layers? Could a royal love story from 3,000 years ago be a metaphor for a mass admixture event? Let us walk now into legend. Think of a queen, radiant, wise, crossing seas to meet a king from another world. The legend of Sheba and Solomon, of their union producing Menelik I, founding Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty. That's not merely romance. That's ancestral memory cloaked in gold. The Kebra Nagast, that sacred chronicle, calls it divine heritage, Solomon's blood mingled with Sheba's. And what if this isn't myth-making? What if it reflects an actual wave of gene flow? Around 1000 BCE, when Levantine-like DNA began to appear in Ethiopian genomes, at the same time as Semitic scripts and rock-hewn temples emerged, truth and story begin to converge. Look deeper into the DNA of Ethiopian Jews, the Falasha. Their mitochondrial lineages align with near Eastern haplogroups, suggesting mothers who cross seas, days, or centuries, not through scrolls or king's proclamations, but through children, through blood. Few lines in history are so poetic yet scientifically anchored. The Sheba narrative may encode this ancient migration, a symbolic vessel for real cultural fusion and genetic blending. Think of traders sailing from Sabaean Arabia, meeting highland farmers, creating a new identity, half Eurasian, half African, fully alive. It's not just DNA, it's architecture too. Temples, inscriptions dating to the 8th to 7th century BCE, bearing both Ethiopian motifs and South Arabian script. Language, blood, stone, myth, each trace strengthens the others. This isn't a fairy tale, it's evidence hidden in metaphor. It's a cultural memory failing to differentiate between love and lineage. And even as this love story shaped dynasties here, somewhere else, far across the ocean, and centuries later, another fusion quietly began to reweave human identity. But this wasn't the end of mixing. thousands of miles away, another fusion was brewing. On Africa's eastern shore, ancient DNA reveals a world where Persian princes married African queens. On the coral-lapped shores of East Africa, a startling genetic drama played out, written not in scrolls but in chromosomes. In 2023, scientists sequenced 80 ancient Swahili genomes dating from 1250 to 1800 CE and found nearly half of their DNA traced to Southwest Asia, especially Persia, and to a lesser extent India. It wasn't a conquering horde, it was something much more delicate, men from Persia and India joining hands, families, lives with local African women. The result? A population with male ancestry overwhelmingly Asian, 80 to 90% Persian origin, and maternal inheritance deeply rooted in Africa. The maternal line passed on the Bantu tongue, African customs, and diaspora rituals. The paternal line brought new genes, new stories, new connections. These ancient genomes trace a vivid pattern. Coastal towns like Kilwa, Mtwapa, and Sangomnara show complex mosaics. Autosomal DNA formed a gradient between African and Persian Indian ancestry, and male Y chromosomes were almost entirely Persian-derived, haplogroups like J2, G2, R1A, unlike the prevailing Bantu-type lineages seen inland. This wasn't a colonization, it was alliance. As archaeologist Chaparuka Kusimba explained, the Swahili were African at their core, in language, in tomb architecture, in matrilineal kinship, but embraced newcomers who became part of their world. Ancient oral traditions, like the Kilwa Chronicle, speak of Shirazi princes, Persian travellers, founding coastal dynasties. Those stories, long dismissed, now echo true in DNA. So here, on Africa's rim, identity wasn't pure, it was powerful in its mixing. And as centuries passed, the wave of Arabian ancestry began to rise, altering the DNA tapestry yet again. So what's next? What undiscovered bones buried deep in the rift might rewrite everything again? What if the genetic map of the Horn isn't bizarre, but a sacred archive of humanity's entire story? That question echoes like a drumbeat across time, but maybe it's not about what comes next. Maybe it's about how we've misunderstood what came before. Because this DNA, this so-called strange code found in Somali's Oromos Afars, it isn't strange at all. It's sacred. It's not a mistake. It's a living scripture carved into the bodies of people who've stood at the world's genetic crossroads for tens of thousands of years. In the heart of the Rift Valley, from the caves of Ethiopia to the cliffs of Eritrea, genes whisper stories far older than kings or flags. They tell us that the Horn was never a margin, it was the origin. This is where haplogroup L3 emerged, some 70,000 years ago, from which all humans outside Africa descend. Every Eurasian heartbeat today, a rhythm that began here. When Eurasian farmers returned around 1000 BCE, they didn't overwrite the Horn. They merged into it. They added their verses to an already ancient song. This is why the DNA of Motorman, untouched by Eurasian influence, still echoes in modern Ari Highlanders, like a genetic fossil bridging prehistory and present. And yet, we keep calling it mixed, as if that's a flaw. But what if a hybrid is holy? What if this intricate web of African and Eurasian ancestry isn't chaos, but code? A code that preserved resilience, encoded memory, and refused erasure. And what if we've been reading it wrong all along? The Horn's DNA doesn't break the rules of race or history, it burns them to the ground. It proves that identity was always movement, always story, always sacred. But what if, buried even deeper, lies DNA so ancient it doesn't belong to Homo sapiens at all?